Okay, today is day 2, talking about scatter plots. Yesterday we looked at scatter plots and we determined first if the relationship of the data set is linear, nonlinear, or if there was no relationship at all. And then second, we determined that if it was linear, we could determine if it was positive association or positive correlation, or if it was negative association or negative correlation. Today, we're going to talk about how we can look at data to make predictions based on the scatter plot and the trends that we can see in the data. So to introduce this, we're going to start by talking about trend lines. So the trend line, or line of best fit, is just a line that represents the trend or relationship between two variables on a scatter plot. So we're going to talk a little bit about what a trend line does. What does it not necessarily do? So it does reflect the general relationship between variables in the data set, and it helps make possible predictions, just helps make reasonable predictions, let's say that, about what could happen. It does not necessarily pass through or connect all points in the data set. So when you're drawing a trend line, you're trying to follow the general idea of the points, not trying to connect the dots with them. Another thing that the trend line does not necessarily do is show exactly what will happen. So when you're thinking about a data set, like in this case, the weight and heights of the babies, each point represents an individual baby that was measured for its height and weighed for its weight. And each point on this data set is an actual individual thing that was measured. And if you know anything about the real world, you know that not everything follows a rule perfectly every single time. There are general trends in data, and there are general trends in the real world, but there are always exceptions and outliers, and things don't perfectly follow a formula every single time. So if you look at this first baby, it was 20 inches, it's our x-axis, and it weighs about 8.7 pounds. This next baby, it was taller, but it weighed only 8 pounds. And then the next baby was at 21.5, and it weighed 10 pounds. And you can see each one of these points represents an individual baby. And generally, you'll notice that as the height goes up, the weight of these babies tends to go up as well. So the trend, if you draw a line in between, or just the line that seems to go in between all of these points the best, you can see that that has a positive correlation between the height of a baby and the weight of a baby. As the height goes up, the weight tends to go up. But it's not necessarily that every baby who is taller also weighs more. There are a lot more factors in the real world than just the two variables you're looking at. So it's possible that a baby who is taller happens to weigh less than a baby who is shorter. And this is exactly what the trend can help us determine is an idea of what might happen, but it's not necessarily going to be 100% certain every time. So it's about making reasonable predictions, not exactly what will happen. So if we were going to draw a trend line, the whole purpose of drawing the trend line is to help us make predictions. So here's a question. What do you expect a baby who is 27 inches to weigh. So once you've got your data set, what you want to do, and this has already been done for us, is try to draw the best possible trend line you can. It's not going to be perfect, but you want to try to have your line go in between all the points as best as possible. And maybe a better rule is that you want to have pretty much the same number of points above the line as you do below the line, and about the same distance between the points and the line as you can. So you can see that this is a little bit far away and this is a little bit far away. It's not like one is much further away than another. So this looks like a pretty good trend line. And once you have your trend line, you're going to use that to make your predictions. You're not going to use a point on the graph. You're going to use the trend line you drew to make a prediction. So we're trying to predict what a baby who is 27 inches tall is going to weigh. So what you're going to do is you're going to go onto the graph, you're going to look for where the height is 27 inches, and you're going to go up to your trend line, and you're going to see, what can I expect a baby who is 27 inches tall to weigh based on the trend line? So at 27 inches, my x is 27, it looks like my weight should be about 15 pounds. So I'm going to put 15 pounds because that's where the y intersects the line for the given x. So at 27 inches, my y is 15. So that means a 27-inch baby can be expected to weigh 15 pounds. Let's look at another example. Here we have an example of a resting heart rate based on or dependent on the number of hours of exercise a person gets. So I'm going to ask a different question here. Let me see if I can find a really good point that's going to illustrate this. Perfect. What can you, or what do you expect, and this is all about making predictions, a person's heart rate to be if they get 6 hours of exercise? Flip those. There we go. Let's just scratch it out. Try it again. Exercise. Okay. So go ahead and try to make a prediction. And remember, we're using the trend line to make predictions about this data set. These are each individual people who they answered how much exercise they get per week, and then they measured their resting heart rate. Give you a second to think about what you might guess the resting heart rate of a person who happens to get 6 hours of exercise every week. So hopefully you made a prediction. So I'm going to take a look at 6 hours, and I'm going to go up. And you'll notice there's a point that's pretty much right at 6 hours. But we're not using the points to make prediction. We're using the trend lines. We made this trend line by trying to go in between all the dots as best as we can. And then we use these dots to make our trend line, but we use the trend line to make predictions. So at 6 hours, you can actually see that not 51 or 50 beats per minute is the expected heart rate for somebody who gets 6 hours of exercise. It's actually closer to 55. So you want to make sure you're using that trend line to make your predictions, not your points. The points help you get the trend line. The trend line helps you make predictions about what you can expect. Not exactly what will happen, but what you can expect. Okay, let's go ahead and flip over to the other side. And we're going to look at another example. This time they don't draw the trend line for us. So we're looking at an evening watching TV and sleeping. So based on the number of hours watching TV, these people told us how many hours they watch TV in a given night. And then they also reported how much sleep they got on that day. So this person, they got 4 hours of TV time and then 5 hours of sleep. This particular person got 2 hours of TV watching and then a little more than 6 hours of sleep. But a different person, they spent 2 hours watching TV and they got 8 hours of sleep. So we're going to use this to make predictions about what might happen. So first, you need to draw a trend line. And we're going to draw this trend line so we can answer the question, how much sleep can you expect a person who watched TV for 5 hours to get? So we're going to start by drawing the trend line. So remember, we're trying to draw it in between the dots as best as possible. A small tip that might help you draw a better trend line is to take your ID, or just any straight edge, and try to see if you can find a place. And this helps better if it is in between, or if it's clear so you can see the dots are in between as best as possible. And it looks like this is a pretty good spot. So whatever it takes for you to draw a trend line, it doesn't have to be perfect. We're just trying to sketch the best possible one. And you can see that that seems to go pretty close to through the dots as possible. Maybe I could make it a little higher. You can see that there's slightly more dots above than there are below. So maybe I could move it up a little bit. It's not a perfect science. And there are ways to get a perfect calculation for the best possible trend line. But when you're doing things by hand, you've got to accept some degree of inaccuracy. So we're just going to let it be. This trend line is good enough. So remember, we're not looking for points when we make a prediction to answer this question. We're looking at the trend line. So if somebody is watching 5 hours of TV, I want to go to the x-axis and find the x value, 5, and go up to where my trend line is and see what the y value for that point is. So at 5 hours of TV, you can expect 4 hours of TV, or sleep, sorry. 5 hours of TV, 4 hours of sleep. Good enough. Okay, let's do one more example. So again, now we're looking at a used car value. So the years since it was purchased, and then the car's value in thousands of dollars. So again, first thing is a trend line, and then I want to predict the value for a 10-year-old car. So we're going to draw a trend line as best as we can. And then we're going to go through, maybe like that. I think that's pretty good enough. So at 10 years, you can see about $10,000 or $18,000. Real quick, we're going to go back through these examples, and I want to ask a couple questions. Is this relationship, is it linear, non-linear, or does it have no relationship? It is linear. Now that we know it's linear, does this have a positive or negative correlation? Take a moment and think. It is positive. Let's take a look at this one. Hopefully you can tell. It is linear. And then now, is that a positive or negative correlation? It is negative. Now looking at this next one. linear, and negative. And again, linear and negative. Just a couple things to remember. A trend line follows the trend of the data to show the relationship between the two variables. A trend line trend line may or may not pass through points on the scatter plot. So you'll notice here the trend line is crossed right through one of my points. But it's not about playing connect the dots. Over here, the trend line passed through none of the data. So it doesn't really matter if it passes through or not as long as it's going between the points. Trend lines do not always begin at the origin or pass through 0, 0. And predictions made from a trend line are reasonable and are not exact. It's not about finding the exact number. You can't predict for certain how much a baby's going to weigh based on its height. There are other factors. But you can make general predictions.